The hangar hummed with $50 million of cold ambition. A silver Gulfstream G700 gleamed under harsh lights. Isabella Vaughn, a ruthless CEO, stood with crossed arms, patience gone. Facing her was Daniel, a single dad in a stained technician's vest. Isabella smirked, pointing at the cockpit. "You talk about standards? Fly this jet, then we'll talk." Her executive snickered. He was just a janitor to them. Daniel didn't flinch. He checked the maintenance log. He looked at the chief pilot. He spoke calmly, voice cutting the silence. "If the regulations allow it, I'm ready." The laughter died. Then the engine screamed alive. His name was Daniel Mercer, 47 years old, with the kind of stillness that only comes from weathering storms that would break lesser men. He had salt and pepper hair, cut efficiently short, and eyes that were constantly scanning his environment, checking exits, checking pressure gauges, checking the emotional temperature of the room. He was a single father. His true north, the only thing that mattered in his universe, was his 10-year-old daughter, Hannah. At this moment, Hannah was sitting in the small, glass-walled reception area of the adjacent office building, quietly drawing in a sketchbook. She wasn't drawing ponies or castles. She was drawing a map of all the places she and her dad would go if they ever had money again. She was used to waiting. She was used to the smell of jet fuel and the sound of turbines. She knew her dad was the smartest man in the world, even if he wore a jumpsuit instead of a suit. She knew why he did it. She remembered the day her mother didn't come home, the car accident that shattered their world 4 years ago. She remembered the silence that filled their house afterwards, a silence her father had filled with his constant, unwavering presence. She remembered him trading his captain's stripes for a toolbox so he could be there to make her breakfast every single morning and tuck her in every single night. He had traded the view from 40,000 feet for the view of her growing up, and in his heart, he knew he got the better deal. But the ache for the sky never truly left him. It just sat dormant, like an engine waiting for a spark. Daniel wasn't just a mechanic. For 15 years, he had been an elite aviator. He had captained heavy corporate jets across the Atlantic and the Pacific. He had 7,200 flight hours logged. Hours spent battling crosswinds in Aspen, navigating the crowded airspace of London Heathrow, and managing in-flight emergencies that never made the news because he handled them so quietly. He had flown billionaires, heads of state, and rock stars. He knew the sensation of Mach 0.90 cruise and the delicate dance of a Cat 3 instrument landing in zero visibility. But 4 years ago, he walked away. The lifestyle of a corporate pilot, the on-call status, the weeks away from home, the missed milestones, the constant pressure to say yes to unsafe flights was incompatible with raising a grieving 6-year-old girl alone. He couldn't be a father via video call. So he resigned. He took a job as an operational safety consultant and technical inspector. It was a step down in prestige, a massive step down in pay, but a giant leap up in stability. He audited maintenance logs, he inspected landing gear, he ensured that other pilots came home safely, even if he wasn't the one flying them. The woman standing opposite him was Isabella Vaughn, 39 years old, sharp, ambitious, and currently under immense pressure. She was the newly appointed CEO of Vaughn Enterprises, a global conglomerate expanding aggressively into Asian markets. She was a woman who had fought for every inch of ground she stood on, and she had the scars to prove it. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, another message from the board chairman asking why the logistics division was lagging. She needed a win. She needed perfection. She had just purchased this jet, a brand new Gulfstream G700, to be the crown jewel of her corporate fleet. She wanted the best. She wanted flash. She wanted a flight crew that looked like they walked out of a movie poster, young, dynamic, and fearless. She had been interviewing candidates for the director of flight operations role for weeks. She dismissed Daniel's application almost immediately. To her, he was a has-been, a man who had aged out of the prime seat. She saw his faded uniform and his quiet demeanor, and she saw weakness. She saw a man who lacked the killer instinct she believed was necessary to lead her fleet. She needed someone who could keep up with her pace, not someone who checked tire pressure. She had called him into this hangar not to hire him, but to prove a point to her board. That experience was just a code word for outdated. She wanted to expose him as a relic. She wanted to show that her preference for young, aggressive pilots was the right strategic move. She wanted to validate her own bias. "Mr. Mercer," Isabella said, her voice echoing in the vast space, cutting through the hum of the ventilation system. "I've reviewed your file. Your license is valid, yes, but you haven't flown a commercial leg in 4 years. Aviation is a perishable skill. It rots if you don't use it. You're applying to lead my fleet, but frankly, I think you're better suited to washing the windows. You're a clipboard warrior, not a commander." Daniel looked at her. He didn't feel anger. He felt a quiet, professional pity. He had seen CEOs like her before. People who confused volume with velocity and arrogance with ability. They usually ended up with broken companies or broken planes. "My license is current on this airframe type, Ms. Vaughn," Daniel replied, his voice level, refusing to take the bait. "And experience doesn't rot, it ripens. I don't fly to build hours anymore. I fly to ensure safety. There is a difference between a pilot who flies to look good and a pilot who flies to get there." Isabella laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Safety is a given. I need performance. I need someone who can get me to Tokyo in record time, not someone who quotes the rule book and delays my schedule because of a cloud." She decided to end the interview right there. She decided to humiliate him so he would withdraw his application and stop wasting her time. Isabella walked closer to the gleaming silver jet. She ran a hand along the smooth, cold metal of the fuselage. The G700 was a masterpiece of aerodynamics, capable of flying 7,500 nautical miles at Mach 0.85. It was a time machine for the ultra-wealthy. "You talk a big game about standards, Mr. Mercer," she said, turning to face him. "But words are cheap. My current chief pilot, Captain Sterling, tells me this bird is ready to fly. He says it's perfect. He says he could fly it blindfolded." Captain Sterling, a tall, handsome man in a pristine uniform who stood by the wing, nodded confidently. He checked his expensive watch, looking bored. He was exactly the kind of pilot Isabella liked. Confident, flashy, eager to please, and willing to bend the rules to keep the boss happy. He whispered something to the co-pilot, a joke about Grandpa needing a nap, and they both snickered. "But you," Isabella continued, looking Daniel up and down, sneering at his oil-stained boots and the grease under his fingernails. "You walked around this plane for 10 minutes and wrote 3 pages of notes. You think you see things my team missed? You think you're smarter than the active crews who fly this bird every day?" Daniel held up his clipboard. "I don't think, Ms. Vaughn. I observe. There are discrepancies in the fuel load distribution logs versus the visual dipstick reading. The density calculation is off by 0.5%, and the tire wear on the left main gear suggests a braking imbalance that isn't noted in the maintenance computer. It's subtle, but it's there. At 140 knots on a wet runway, subtle becomes dangerous." Isabella rolled her eyes. "Paperwork, bureaucracy. That's all you have. You're hiding behind checklists because you're afraid to actually touch the controls. You're afraid you've lost your touch. You're afraid that if you get in that seat, you'll realize the sky moved on without you." She gestured dramatically to the open door of the aircraft, the stairs illuminated by soft LED lights. "Fly this jet, then we'll talk." It wasn't a request. It was a dare. It was a public challenge meant to break him. The executive team, her VP of Finance, her head of HR, her assistants, all exchanged amused glances. They expected Daniel to fold. They expected him to stutter, make an excuse about insurance, and walk away with his tail between his legs. They were ready to laugh. But Daniel didn't move. He didn't rush toward the cockpit with the eagerness of a puppy. He stood his ground. He looked at the jet not as a trophy, but as a complex machine that could kill everyone on board if not respected. He looked at the pitot tubes, checking for covers. He checked the static ports. "Fly it?" Daniel asked calmly. "Take it up," Isabella said. "A functional check flight. Captain Sterling is the pilot in command, PIC. You sit right seat. Show me you can actually handle a machine of this power, or get out of my hangar and go back to your mop." It was a trap. If he flew recklessly to impress her, he violated his own principles. If he refused, he looked like a coward. Daniel turned to Captain Sterling. "Captain, are you the designated PIC for this flight?" "I am," Sterling said, smirking slightly. "If you think you can keep up, old man." Daniel ignored the jab. "And what is the current maintenance status of the hydraulic accumulators?" "I noticed the pressure gauge on the number 2 system was reading at the low limit of the green arc before engine start. Have you verified the nitrogen precharge?" Sterling faltered for a second. The smirk slipped. It's within limits. It's fine. We checked it last week. Stop stalling." Isabella stepped in, her patience gone. "See? He's terrified. He's looking for an excuse not to fly. He's looking for a way out." Daniel closed his clipboard with a snap. He looked at Isabella with eyes that were cold and hard, stripped of any deference. "I am not stalling, Ms. Vaughn. I am verifying. A pilot who rushes into a cockpit without knowing the state of his machine is a suicide risk, not an asset. You want performance? Performance starts with discipline. It starts with knowing that your number 2 hydraulic system is marginal before you leave the ground. It starts with respect for the physics of flight." He walked past her. He walked toward the stairs. "I will fly, but I will fly by the book. If you want a stunt show, hire a clown. If you want a pilot, let's go." He climbed the stairs. The laughter in the hangar died instantly. There was something in his voice, a weight, a gravity, that made the joke seem suddenly very small. The cockpit of the G700 was a spaceship of glass screens and touch panels. It smelled of new leather and ozone. It was a stark contrast to the grease and noise of the hangar floor. Daniel strapped into the right seat. He adjusted the seat height, the rudder pedals, the armrests. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion. Every movement had a purpose. There was no wasted energy. He plugged in his headset, the noise-canceling feature instantly drowning out the ambient hum. He took a breath, inhaling the scent of the avionics, a smell he hadn't realized he missed so desperately until this very moment. Isabella, breaking protocol, sat in the jump seat behind them. She wanted to witness his failure firsthand. She wanted to see him sweat. She wanted to be right. "Let's go," Sterling said, reaching for the start switches. "Checklist," Daniel said firmly. Sterling sighed. "We know the flow, Mercer. Let's just burn and turn. The boss is watching." "Checklist," Daniel repeated. His voice wasn't loud, but it was absolute. It was the voice of a man who had commanded crews for 2 decades. It was the voice of authority. Sterling rolled his eyes but grabbed the electronic checklist. "Fine. Electrical, on, hydraulics, auto." Daniel verified every item. He didn't just nod. He looked at the screens. He tapped the indicators. He checked the system pages. When they reached the weight and balance section, Daniel stopped. "Captain, we have 4 passengers on board, plus full fuel in the wings. The baggage compartment is empty. The center of gravity is forward of the optimal envelope. If we rotate at standard speeds, the nose will be heavy. We need to trim nose up by 1.5 units to compensate, or the takeoff roll will be extended by 400 feet and the rotation will be abrupt." Isabella listened from the back. She didn't understand the technical jargon about CG envelopes, but she understood the tone. Daniel wasn't guessing, he was calculating. He was building a mental model of the aircraft's physics. Sterling frowned, checking the flight computer. The computer says, "Wait, you're right. It is nose heavy. I didn't account for the empty cargo hold." "Set trim," Daniel said. They started the engines. The Rolls-Royce Pearl 700s whined to life, settling into a powerful, rhythmic hum. Daniel watched the interstage turbine temperature, ITT, start limits closely. He felt the vibration travel up through the floorboards and into his spine, a familiar awakening. Daniel's hands hovered over the active control side sticks. He didn't grip them. He rested his fingertips on the control. "Ready for taxi," Daniel said. They taxied to the runway. Daniel handled the radio communications with crisp, professional precision. No uhs, no ums. Just pure information transmission. "Cleared for takeoff," the tower announced. Sterling pushed the throttles forward. "Your aircraft, Mercer." "My aircraft," Daniel confirmed. The engines roared. 36,000 pounds of thrust kicked them in the back. The runway lights blurred into streaks. Isabella gripped her armrests. She expected Daniel to yank the plane into the sky, to try and show off the power, to prove he was a real pilot. She braced for the G-force. Instead, nothing happened. The plane accelerated, smoothly, linearly. V1, Daniel called. Rotate. Daniel applied back pressure on the side stick. It wasn't a pull. It was a thought, a gentle persuasion. The nose rose, the main wheels left the ground. Isabella waited for the lurch, the G-force slam, the stomach drop sensation she always felt when Sterling flew. It never came. The jet transitioned from ground to air with such liquid smoothness that Isabella had to look at the altimeter to confirm they were flying. It was as if the earth had simply fallen away beneath them. Daniel didn't bank hard. He didn't pull a steep climb. He flew the departure profile with mathematical exactness. He kept the flight path vector pinned to the director crosshairs as if they were glued together. He managed the energy state of the aircraft perfectly, trading airspeed for altitude with invisible adjustments. Flaps up, Daniel said. He managed the energy of the aircraft perfectly. He leveled off at 10,000 feet. He adjusted the heading bug with a flick of his wrist, anticipating the wind shear reported by a preceding aircraft. Let's see some maneuvering, Sterling challenged, trying to regain some ground. Steep turns, 45 degrees. Daniel nodded. He rolled the aircraft into a 45-degree bank. Isabella braced herself to be thrown against the side of the cabin, but she didn't move. Daniel added just enough back pressure, just enough rudder to keep the ball centered. The G-force increased slightly, pressing her straight down into her seat, but she didn't slide an inch. It was a coordinated turn of absolute perfection. The coffee in the cup holder didn't even ripple. He rolled out on the exact heading. The altimeter hadn't budged a single foot. He checked the fuel flow. He adjusted the power levers by a millimeter to synchronize the N1 fan speeds perfectly, eliminating a subtle harmonic vibration that had been buzzing in the cabin floor. A vibration Isabella hadn't even noticed until it was gone. The cabin went silent. The vibration stopped. Isabella looked at the back of Daniel's head. He wasn't sweating. He wasn't smiling. He was working. He was completely in his element, a master craftsman with his tool. Let's head back, Sterling said, sounding a little less arrogant. Visual approach, no ILS. This was the hardest part, landing a heavy, fast jet visually without the autopilot guidance. Daniel lined up with the runway. He disconnected the autothrottle. He was hand-flying. Isabella watched the speed tape. Daniel nailed the reference speeds. He managed the drag. He anticipated the thermal updrafts from the tarmac before they even hit the wings. They crossed the threshold. Flare, Daniel whispered to himself. He retarded the throttles. He held the nose off. The main wheels touched the concrete. Chirp. That was it. No thud, no bounce, no shimmy. Just a change in sound from wind noise to tire noise. The transition from flight to ground was imperceptible. Isabella hadn't even felt the impact. Daniel lowered the nose wheel gently. He applied the thrust reversers. He applied the brakes smoothly, ensuring the passengers weren't thrown forward against their belts. He turned off the runway. He cleaned up the flaps. He turned to Sterling. Flight complete. Did we meet your standards, Captain? The jet taxied back to the hangar and shut down. The silence in the cockpit was heavy. Isabella unbuckled her seatbelt. Her heart wasn't racing. Her adrenaline wasn't spiking. She felt calm. She had expected a roller coaster. She had expected a performance designed to thrill. Instead, she got a performance designed to reassure. She realized that for the last 20 minutes, she hadn't thought about the stock price, the board, or the merger. She had just felt safe. They walked down the air stairs. The executive team was waiting, expecting Isabella to mock the janitor. Daniel walked to the bottom of the stairs and stopped. He turned to face Isabella and Captain Sterling. He didn't gloat. He didn't ask, "How was that?" He immediately walked to the left main gear, crouching down to touch the brake assembly with the back of his hand, checking the heat dissipation. He stood up and pulled his clipboard back out. "Flight report," Daniel said, his voice professional and detached. "The aircraft handling is nominal. However, the fuel flow indicators on the number one engine are lagging by 200 milliseconds. It's creating a slight asymmetry in the auto-throttle response. It needs a sensor calibration. Isabella stared at him. She realized he hadn't just flown the plane, he had diagnosed it. Also, Daniel continued, looking at Sterling, your ground crew is loading the baggage nose heavy to save time. It's putting unnecessary strain on the nose gear strut during taxi. You can feel the vibration in the rudder pedals. If you continue this practice, you will need a strut rebuild in 6 months. That's a $100,000 repair you can avoid by spending 5 minutes loading correctly. He handed the clipboard to Sterling. And finally, Captain, you missed the yaw damper check on the taxi out. I engaged it for you. But if you miss that on a contaminated runway, you risk a lateral excursion. Standardize your flow. Complacency kills. Sterling looked at the clipboard, his face turning red. He couldn't argue. He knew Daniel was right. He had been sloppy, relying on the plane's automation to save him. The executives were silent. They looked from Daniel to Isabella. Isabella looked at Daniel. She saw the grease on his boots. She saw the faded vest. But she didn't see a janitor anymore. She saw a professional who cared more about the machine than his own ego. You didn't try to impress me, Isabella said quietly. You didn't do anything exciting. Daniel looked her in the eye. Excitement in aviation is a failure of planning, Ms. Vaughn. I don't provide excitement. I provide arrival. You asked me to fly. I flew. The performance speaks for itself. Sterling sighed, lowering his head. He's right, Ms. Vaughn. That was the smoothest flight I've been on in this aircraft. And he caught the hydraulic lag I've been trying to diagnose for weeks. The debate was over. The data had won. Daniel picked up his tool bag. If you're done with the aircraft, I have a scheduled wash to complete on the landing gear. Grease doesn't clean itself. He turned to leave. He was going back to his job. He didn't expect to be hired. He had just schooled the CEO and the chief pilot. In his experience, that usually got you fired, not hired. Powerful people hated being wrong. Mr. Mercer, Isabella called out. Daniel stopped. Isabella walked over to him. The distance between the CEO and the janitor seemed to vanish. I thought you would try to show off, Isabella admitted, her voice losing its edge. I thought you would try to be a cowboy to prove you still had it. I was testing your ego. I have a daughter waiting for me, Daniel said simply. I don't take risks with my life, and I wouldn't take risks with yours. My ego died a long time ago, Miss Vaughn. Now only the mission matters. Isabella nodded. She looked at her reflection in the polished fuselage of the jet. She realized she had been looking for the wrong thing. She had been looking for a star, but she needed an anchor. She needed someone who would tell her the truth, even when she didn't want to hear it. She thought about the board, about the shareholders demanding speed. She needed someone who could stand up to them, just like he stood up to her. I have plenty of pilots who can fly fast, Isabella said. I have plenty who can smile for the cameras. But I don't have anyone who can tell me I'm loading the baggage wrong. I don't have anyone who cares about saving me $100,000 on a strut repair. I don't have anyone who respects the machine like you do. She extended her hand. I am formally offering you the position of Director of Operational Safety. You will oversee the entire fleet. You will train the crews. You will standardize the checklists. And you will have the authority to ground any plane and any pilot, including Captain Sterling, if they don't meet your standards. Daniel looked at her hand. The hours, flexible, Isabella said immediately. You need to pick up Hannah? You pick her up. You want to work from home on Fridays? Done. I don't care when you work. I care that my planes fly like you just flew them. Daniel smiled. It was a small, genuine smile. I can't travel, Ms. Vaughn. You don't travel, she promised. You are the control tower. You stay here. You keep us safe. Daniel shook her hand. I accept. The executives applauded, this time with genuine respect. Isabella watched Daniel walk toward the break room to change out of his vest. She turned to Captain Sterling. Captain, she said coldly, schedule a retraining session with Mr. Mercer for tomorrow morning. You missed a checklist item. Don't let it happen again. Daniel walked out of the hangar into the late afternoon sun. Hannah was waiting by the gate, holding her sketchbook. Did you get in trouble, Dad? She asked, seeing the serious look on his face. Daniel picked up her backpack. No, sweetie, I didn't get in trouble. Did they make you fly the plane? Yeah, Daniel said, opening the car door for her. I flew it. Was it cool? Daniel thought about the perfect trim, the silent cabin, the smooth landing. It was stable, Hannah. It was perfectly, wonderfully stable. He wasn't a janitor anymore. He was the man who kept them safe, and that was the only title that mattered. Hannah looked at him, noticing he stood a little taller today, the shadow over his eyes lifted by the clarity of the sky. If you believe that true mastery speaks in silence, in stability, not in noise and showmanship, hit that subscribe button to follow more stories of real professionalism. Tell us in the comments, have you ever won an argument not by shouting, but by simply doing the job better than anyone else?